So our second keynote address will be presented by Professor Michael Pittman, who has recently been appointed Inaugural Director of General Education at the American University of Armenia. Michael has been a member of our organizing committee and has been valuable for his insights and cogent advice. Gurdjieff's life and writings have been at the center of his scholarship. Building on his disciplinary background in comparative literature and religion, he has paid several research visits to the wider region to conduct research on Gurdjieff's life and his relation to the traditions and practices of Sufism. His book-length work, Classical Spirituality in Contemporary America, The Confluence and Contribution of Gurdjieff and Sufism, Continuum 2012, addresses such cultural and religious influences on Gurdjieff's work. The speaker has agreed to entertain questions on the conclusion of his address, something to bear in mind. Here too, we're breaking new ground. So without more ado, I leave it to Professor.
Thank you, Peter. Should we thank you? Thank you, Peter, and Anahit also for all the incredible organization from, at least from the first time I heard about it about a year and a half ago for this conference. Just to check in, Peter, we're starting 10 minutes late. Should I consider that? Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about education, and I'm really going to be giving some focus to Beelzebub's tales to his grandson. That's a lot of what I worked on in my earlier work and dissertation, and so I think maybe none of the other presentations had as much focus, although Roger Lipsey talked about Ashiata Shiamash a lot, which I'll have some overlap with as well. I do have several slides with text, especially from Beelzebub's tale, so I might pause a little bit more there. You may notice also that my slides should have numbers, so in case there's a question about a particular quote, we can come back to it later after the, yeah? Okay, I'm gonna have to work on this, see? Yes? Sound. Oh, that's interesting to have to listen with headphones to me in English. We'll see how this goes. But you can still give me like a thumbs up if you want me to speak a little bit more loudly. And maybe I'll move my paper over and see if I can move the microphone a little bit closer. Okay. Since its early teaching period, Gurdjieff sought to convey the sense and aim of his ideas primarily through oral instruction, through his teachings and through his school, the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. And in this process, he also tried to prepare as many people as possible to pass on his ideas to others. However, after his near-fatal car accident in 1924, he deduced that he needed a form of transmission for his ideas that would last beyond his own death, and one which would not necessarily be so easily subject to misinterpretation or distortion. To that end, Gurdjieff wrote three main works that make up the series All and Everything. And the first one is provocatively titled Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. It's a lengthy 1,200 plus pages and itself is often referred to as All and Everything. Gurdjieff announces at the beginning of Beelzebub's Tales that each of his three works will be written with a different aim. And the first one is the task of Beelzebub's Tales. Okay. To destroy mercilessly without any compromises whatsoever in the mentation and feelings of the reader. The beliefs and views by centuries rooted in him about everything existing in the world. Good, thank you. After 1935, it appears that Gurdjieff did not write again except according to some sources on certain revisions of Beelzebub's Tales. And perhaps the most immediately accessible level of meaning to be gleaned from even a cursory read, if I can say that, if that's possible, is a social and cultural critique provided in the tales. The ever-widening scope of the tales covers and provides comments on a wide range of subjects relating to the culture and society of different periods of human history, with oftentimes acerbic wit and depth. The topics addressed include not only the weightier discussions of human reason, the soul, state organizations, art, and the causes of war, but also the minutiae of daily life, including eating, using the toilet, hairstyles, chewing gum, bathing, art, vegetarianism, and the use of electricity. One of the remarkable aspects of the work is that even when he discusses seemingly trifling topics, such as the vanity of the so-called comfort seat of the Europeans or the toilet, he may also convey some important detail of his psychological teaching. While the destructive aspect seems to be first and foremost in the first series, the method of his critique deployed throughout the book has both critical and creative aspects. At points in the book, and sometimes simultaneously, he may introduce an alternative history on a given topic, and in the destruction of preconceived notions, associations, and connections, a whole new series of matrices and connections are created. And the creation of this new space, as I've argued in other places, is achieved through the double edge of corrosion and laughter. So I'll get to the laughter a little bit later too, because that's one of the funner aspects of the book, and helps us maybe bear the weight of some of the heavier critiques of our lives in general. So thus this sets the stage for a balanced view of the human, that is, as a three-brained being with mind, body, and feeling intact and fully engaged, and the potential for an even greater cosmic level destiny to fulfill. The tales are told for the edification of Beelzebub's sincere and sympathetic grandson Hussein, and of course the committed reader. Oops. Did that go to the US? Oh. Not questions yet. Hang on. Okay. Guided by his first stated aim to destroy mercilessly, Gurdjieff attempts throughout the first series to destroy the notion of education as it is in its current form. And throughout the tales, education is regularly indicted as one of the most destructive aspects of culture and civilization on Earth. Beelzebub shares with Hussein that, particularly since the Ticlamitian civilization, also identified as Sumeria, before the Babylonian period, education has had a derogatory effect on the psyche of the unfortunate beings of Earth. In several instances, Beelzebub refers to education disparagingly as their maleficent education or abnormal education. Within the tales as a whole, education is situated among a number of factors that are also indicted by terms as the most destructive aspect of culture or influence in the life of people, including religion, art, fashion, and war. So, in particular, these are my words here. Some of the subsequent slides will have quotes from the tales. In particular, education plays a noteworthy role in that it is largely responsible for the inability of people to understand their proper place in the scheme of things, much less the earth or the universe at large. And as a result of their maleficent forms of education, humans do not have any correct information about history, and most importantly, these various forms of education stand as an obstacle to proper understanding and the development of, importantly, the soul, as also Roger referred to. Unlike the sometimes positive references to religion, Beelzebub frames education as almost wholly negative in its influence in human life. Nevertheless, within these discussions of education, we garner some insight into Gurdjieff's view of what education can and should be. So just to introduce, in a certain sense, part of his methodology, he introduces some kind of very disparaging comments about a topic like education, but then kind of slides in something that is framed as a negative, but kind of in reverse. And so he does this with his comments on learned beings of new format. So in order to more fully situate Gurdjieff's discourse on the soul and his understanding of the purpose of human life on Earth, it'll be helpful to look at some of the instances where Gurdjieff talks about education more explicitly. And in an earlier section of the book, he makes reference to a visit to the Ticlamitian civilization. And here he actually frames as a positive what the former learned beings used to be like. And he says, Beelzebub remarks on the truly learned beings. They acquire by their conscious labors and intentional sufferings the ability to contemplate the details of all that exist from the points of view of world arising and world existence, owing chiefly to which they perfect their highest body to the corresponding gradation of the sacred measure of objective reason in order that they might later sense as much about cosmic truths as their higher being body is perfected. So it's quite dense here too. And maybe just to kind of break it down a little bit, and this is a kind of instructive piece about the reading of the tales, I think. In this first part, knowledge is spoken firstly of the knowledge of world arising and world existence, which is predicated on the capacity for conscious labor and intentional suffering. And from this vantage point, one may have the potential for even higher cosmic truths, especially regarding higher being bodies and the creation of the soul. Of note, this also corresponds with the elements of 5 being Obligonian strivings of Ashya Shiamash, which Roger Lipsey also referred to earlier, and a point which I'll come back to later, which Beelzebub and Gurdjieff makes several times in the story of a being worthy to be called a being created in the image of God. So I'm going to talk about Ashya Shiamash in that series a little bit too. So Roger Lipsey gave kind of an interesting preface to this. In a way, he's talking about the positive aspects of what Ashya Shiamash presents and kind of model for a potential society. But here we also find these long critiques about education. In chapter 27, the Organization for Man's Existence, created by the very saintly Ashya Shiamash, Gurdjieff presents a discussion of the possibility for the development of conscience in the face of the now ineffective impulses of faith, hope, and love. Here, I'm going to go into that piece there. Gurdjieff highlights the damage that the current approach to education inflicts. He first introduces this maleficent form of education, used in quotation marks, by highlighting first its falsity and emptiness. He offers the observation that education has become the fundamental means for inculcating in children a dual consciousness. In these chapters, Gurdjieff describes the duality of consciousness as a divorce between the waking consciousness or awareness and the subconscious level of the human psyche. Implied by this critique, Gurdjieff highlights the importance of an undivided, unified conscious awareness as the ideal. In these passages on Ashya Shiamash, Beelzebub explains to Hussein that one of the chief culprits, even if unintentional, that inculcates and maintains this split in human consciousness is education. Moreover, one of the features of this maleficent education is the constant need to instill in children the quality of deceit or two-facedness. Beelzebub remarks on this process. To teach and suggest to their children how to be insincere with others and deceitful in everything has become so ingrained in the beings of the planet Earth of the present time that it has even become their conception of their duty towards their children. And this kind of conduct towards their children they call by the famous word education. They educate their children never to be able and never to dare to do as the conscience present in them instinctively directs. Beelzebub highlights that one of the chief negative consequences of the education is the resulting insincerity or dishonesty here, which even becomes seen by them as a kind of duty. And, of course, as also referenced earlier in the conversation about Ashya Shiamash, conscience, which is submerged within the subconsciousness, is not allowed to come out or operate in human awareness. In a talk from 1943, in response to a question about raising children, Gurdjieff reflects the same critique in a comment about the way that parents and relatives inculcate this mechanical and dual consciousness in their children. Everyone here has had this upbringing. It is specific to France. I have noticed this through a very unusual experiment. I always carry bonbons in my pocket, and when I see a child, I give him some. There's always someone with a child, father, mother, or aunt. Without exception, all of them say the same thing to the child. What do you say? Automatically, little by little, the child says thank you to everything and no longer feels anything. It's idiotic. It's mad. When a child wishes to thank me, I understand him. He speaks a language I understand. And it is this language that I love. Just to hear it and see these impulses every day, I give out 5 kilos of bonbons, for which I pay 410 francs a kilo just to see these impulses. But when you say to children, what do you say? You kill everything. It's merde. Father, mother, they kill the child for the future and they kill his goodwill. This is a good example. You know, I don't know how you understand it, but for me, it is very typical. I give it as an example. We prepare everything automatically. We make children function like doorbells that ring when pushed like electric buzzers. So kind of condemnation a little bit, maybe throwing in merde, which is, he had some funny comments on that too, and says it's a good method to shock people too. Right? And when someone was laughing about this in another instance where he uses this in the talks from 1943. So this automaticity, as indicated in Gurdjieff's sometimes raw descriptions, eventually causes children to no longer feel anything and to act automatically, like a simple doorbell that buzzes when pressed. Chief among the disastrous results of this kind of education is not just the loss of feeling in general, but the loss of the potential for real conscience. While deceit and insincerity predominate, the quality or organ of conscience is unable to function as it should, or, in the larger frame of Beelzebub's tales, as it does in all other three-brained beings in the universe. As elucidated in the chapters on Ashiata Shiamach, conscience is viewed as one of the means by which humans create the conditions for the development of the soul. As long as the instinctive directions of conscience remain inaccessible to the conscious mind, humans have little or no chance to acquire any degree of independence or the beginnings of what Gurdjieff calls objective morality. In another instance, in the chapter on France, Beelzebub describes how education destroys nature's direct influence in the proper formation of the young beings on Earth. This peculiarity is acquired in them, once again, thanks to that maleficent usage of invented by themselves, which they call education. The point is that there, in children, from the very first day, as they express it, of their appearance on God's earth, when nature herself is still continuing to form the given prime conception of the future three-brained responsible being, they begin, by the same maleficent education of theirs, to hinder nature from herself producing the necessary formation. Though the details are not specified in this passage or adjacent to it, the influence of nature is understood to be a proper element of education. This also follows from the larger frame of the tales, which portrays the earth and the beings there as out of sync with the larger flow of development and evolution of the universe at large. Beelzebub goes on in this chapter to describe the process of education and the way in which the young beings of Earth are diverted from reality and their true purpose. In describing this destructive process, he also provides some of the critical terms through which we might understand what a proper education is and could be. While Beelzebub continues to describe the negative effects, he also indicates the importance of the three brains or centers. Thanks to their maleficent usage to educate, they fill and drive into what are called the Spezzatura Alativian concentrations, or they themselves would say the brains of these newly born beings, all kinds of their ephemerally fantastic ideas, which brains are localized in general in beings for the perception and accumulation of all kinds of impressions, as well as of the results of conscious being awareness, and which among the newly born are still quite pure and of maximum receptivity, also kind of reflecting that comment about the children that he gives bonbons to. The Spezzatura Alativian concentrations, or brains in the passage above, refers to the three centers: thinking, feeling, or the moving or instinctive physical center. Each of these brains or centers is capable of distinct capacities necessary for a complete psychic and spiritual development, and each center requires a proper education to function both independently and harmoniously with each other. Again, in the larger frame of the tales, this deficit is presented in contrast with all other three-brained beings, for whom this takes place more or less naturally. Beelzebub goes on to describe the effects of this failure to educate each center properly in another passage following. Firstly, the general functioning present in their whole being of the sum of almost all their functions for active being manifestations, little by little adapts itself to respond only to the sum of these false and fantastic ideas. And secondly, the whole presence of each one of them gradually accustoms itself to perceive all subsequent new external impressions without any participation at all of those being factors which in general are put in the beings for new perceptions. That is to say, to perceive them only also according to these previously introduced false and fantastic ideas present in them. So this is quite a mouthful. I mean, Gurdjieff was also influenced kind of by the literature, I think we can see of the day too, especially Russian literature, which tends to have much longer sentences. Well, some of his sentences sometimes can be like 160 plus words. But we can break it down. No, won't break this one down too much, but just say or kind of summarize. It's basically this sort of formulation. Children are introduced to these false and fantastic ideas, and then subsequently it forms these preconceived notions, which then they judge and evaluate everything else without taking anything in new. Of particular note, according to Beelzebub, this is the reason why the beings are incapable of independent critical reflection or logical thought. When these contemporary favorites of yours already become responsible beings, everything newly seen and newly heard is perceived by them of its own accord automatically, without the participation of any effort whatsoever on the part of their essence functions, and without at all evoking in them, as I have already said, the being need itself of sensing and understanding everything proceeding within them as well as without. In a word, they are satisfied with that alone which someone once consciously or unconsciously put into them. Right? So this very narrow, limited consciousness that is created by our systems of education. But it's also part of the method too, you can see in this, where it's introducing the limitations, but also introducing the kind of terms and ideas through which we can understand like what actually could take place. What is the potential for human beings? And this description, for example, of listening and having their essence participate and evoke in us this being need for understanding all that takes place within us and without it and around us. This unsuitable and ineffective process of education continues for the entirety of their or our perhaps preparatory period or use, which is crucial for their so-called responsible age. Humans have become so accustomed to the mechanical reception of new information, data, or knowledge, they only process all new perceptions according to the previously false ideas placed in them during their education. How are we doing? Okay? All right. Let's check in. This is a longer kind of time to also have me more or less reading, but if there are moments we can also pause if needed to be able to digest. There's a lot. I'll continue then with another discussion in the chapter of America. The distortion of history and the contribution of prior cultures is addressed in this chapter. And he goes on to say, owing to the consequences of that same famous education of theirs, so many times mentioned by me. So it's like he refers to this all throughout the book. And of course, we can see the larger frame of the tales being a kind of different model for education too, for Hussein's edification and ours as a reader. There inevitably arise in the common presences of each of them data for the definite conviction in the former epochs on their planet that beings similar to them had never perfected themselves to that reason, to that which their contemporaries have attained, and in which they still continue to perfect themselves. Beelzebub goes on to say that this notion is unpardonable because they should be able to deduce by the process of comparative logic that their own time and achievements are unparalleled is a childish idea. So basically just kind of the critique that we assume that our civilization is the best, there's never been another better one, and that, there's no reason to even compare ourselves to prior civilizations or to learn about them. At the same time, he makes a comment that people also tend to borrow the words of sages of the past and give out these words as if they were their own without any remorse of conscience. So a little comment, I think maybe some of this is funny, but there's some more explicit things that I think are a little bit funnier. And I've talked a lot about Gurdjieffian laughter in my work. And interestingly, Roger Lipsey has also kind of honed in on this idea that there's a parallel between Gurdjieff and Rabelais, the late humanistic thinker who was also a priest and theologian, and also wrote this really biting book. And there are some parallels, and there are some interesting comments. In some discussions about Rabelais' method, some of the critiques of Mikhail Bakhtin, who was a Russian literary critic living around the same time as Gurdjieff, really has some really interesting things to say about Rabelais that are also quite applicable to Gurdjieff in terms of teasing out some of what's going on in the way that he's presenting his ideas, critiques, but also the elements of humor. But there's still a Caucasian element for sure. I mean, that Gurdjieff was from Gyumri, and there's a kind of Gyumri-like sense of humor that's in the tales as well. But a comment on Gurdjieffian laughter in education. Beelzebub frequently offers biting but mirthful commentary on the serious discussions with grave import, such as the state of the human psyche and its impending dangerous results. He describes the so-called learned beings as those who learned by rote as much as possible about every kind of vacuous information, such as old women love to relate about what was presumably said in olden times. Perhaps a bias about women there, but may be revealed. But still, the comment adds this levity to the text. Summing up his conclusions about these learned beings of the contemporary period, Beelzebub quotes his favorite sage among the three-brained beings, Nasruddin. Note, by the way, that for the definition of the importance of the learned there, our venerated Nasruddin also has a sentence expressed in the words, "Everybody talks as if our learned know that 100 is 50. Oh yeah, I jumped ahead a little bit. This is my next one. And again, in the Ashiata Shimash series, in a discussion of the Gomanisms and the transmission of knowledge about events in the past to future generations, Beelzebub derides the ordinary means by which scraps of information are inherited by generations. Beelzebub here invokes another applicable and witty saying of Mullah Nasruddin to illustrate the point. How the contemporary learned beings of the planet Earth concoct their hodgepodge from scraps of information which reach them is very well defined in one of the wise sentences of our dear Mullah Nasruddin, which consists of the following words: "A flea exists in the world just for one thing, that when it sneezes, that deluge should occur with the description of which our learned beings love so much to busy themselves." So getting into some of the minutiae there too, which maybe academics or scholars can get into without especially considering the larger perspective or even the aim of human existence in the first place. Beelzebub goes on to tell Hussein that it is always difficult to keep from laughing whenever he heard the explanations about the past or a lecture given by these new learned beings. He adds, "These lectures or stories that are crammed with fiction so absurd that even if our arch cunning Lucifer or his assistants tried to invent them, they could not succeed." Through Gurdjieffian laughter, the reader is propelled into a distance view of these sad yet comical three-brained beings of Earth. This view from our distant world subtly invites a critical and distanced vision of our own lives that simultaneously forces one to examine one's own subject position in relation to the scenarios and perspectives presented. Several pages later, and perhaps apropos of many of us here in this current gathering, Beelzebub again derides the influence and results of these learned beings of new format. In a jibe about the university or the highest place of education, he amusingly offers A university is just that hearth on which everything acquired during decades and centuries by preceding beings is burned. And upon this hearth, 1.5 day tasty lentil soup is quickly cooked to take the place of everything attained by the century conscious and unconscious efforts and labors of their unfortunate ancestors. So we could sit with this one for a while too and kind of think about our approach, learned beings of new format, perhaps. So moving towards a conclusion, but not quite yet. In the reflective concluding chapter from the author, Gurdjieff, in his own words, deliberates upon the means of education and the resultant loss of critical thinking in people. Based chiefly on compelling the young to learn by rote as many words as possible, differentiated from one from the other, only by the impression received from their consonants, and not by the real pith of the meaning put into them, the system of education has resulted in the gradual loss in people of the capacity to ponder and reflect upon what they are talking about and upon what is being said to them. So this pondering piece also in a ways and shows up in terms of pondering, contemplating, and as a predicated on, as actually presented in the earlier comment about genuine learned beings, the development of being, so that one understands one's proper place in the universe. This mechanical form of education in which students learn by rote concepts and ideas and regurgitate them to their teachers is part and parcel of the earthly education that inhibits and dampens even the possibility of critical thought, reflection, and genuine pondering. Throughout Beelzebub's tales, education is portrayed as the means by which the properties of the organ Kunterbuffer are maintained and one of the chief factors for the predominance of egoistic impulses, which also Roger talked about a little bit earlier. If a proper education was provided for with a balance between thought, feeling, and body, then the impulses of faith, hope, and love, and perhaps especially conscience, could have the potential to come to full fruition during responsible age. As it stands, education inhibits the development of a proper active consciousness, and the being impulses, faith, hope, and love fail to reach conscious awareness. Gurdjieff here provides a basic yet novel approach to the psychology of the unformed and uncreated human being. Here it may be opportune to reflect a little bit more upon the method of the tales. Gurdjieff attempts to destroy all the associative links with our conception of what the human being is, has been, or might be. For according to his understanding of psychology and the mechanisms of its formation, education, along with culture, religion, art, and the rest, our conscious awareness will not allow anything new to enter in. Thus, if something does not correspond to the pre-established and mechanical measure of our awareness, it is disregarded and ignored. Thus, in order for education to be effective in these conditions, all of the habitual matrices of our conscious awareness as formed in language must be destroyed, as the Tales attempts to do. Gurdjieff's text relentlessly seeks to dismantle and destroy our ordinary view of things instilled in our awareness through education. Only then will the possibility arise for contemplating even the beginnings of something new. So what is this new possibility or potential offered by Gurdjieff for our contemplation? Throughout the tales, I'd like to return back to one particular point that it's made at several moments in the book that I referred to earlier. And once again, it is not something entirely new, but something that has been with us for many centuries. In the chapter on America, Gurdjieff comes back again to the distortions resulting from the unfortunate customs and education on the planet Earth. These customs existing there progressively increase year by year the duality of the personality and mind of the beings there. But the principal evil lies in this, that at the present time there, all the Askiel-Natsnel of the rising generation, or the education of children, is rendered and reduced only to the adoption of these innumerable customs which exist among them and engender only immorality. Hence it is that year by year the data crystallized in them by tens of centuries for the being of an image of God, and not simply, as they themselves would say, of an animal, are on the one hand decrystallized, and on the other hand their psyche is already becoming almost such as our dear teacher defines by the words, "There is everything in him except himself." So to conclude, this is really my conclusion. Does this critique of education and the human predicament still apply, nearly now 100 years later? And if we are still at present, as the Mullah Nasser ad-Din describes following this prior quote, no better than pieces of pressed meat, how do we respond to this dilemma? Are Gurdjieff's ideas and approach still relevant? How are we to live, as he suggests in this final lofty admonition, to live in the image of God as a genuine citizen of not just the earth, but the megalocosmos? Or do we die only as waste to be consumed by something else? And I hope that we might go some distance in responding to this question here and together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pittman, for your wonderful presentation. I think we have 5 minutes to take questions, comments, if you'd like.
Choose one.
I wanted to ask, is there any teachings or insights in Gurdjieff ideas about what can we do going forward in our society with emerging AI that could potentially replace a lot of the traditional, job and requirements of humans to learn, certain things. So what I'm trying to say is, in Gurdjieff interdisciplinarities, is there an answer also to retain and preserve the relevance of the human individual, even in the race of AI?
This is a big question, an interesting one, I think, too. I don't know if I have much to say immediately, except, and maybe this is a big exception for me, too, is thinking about his notion of legomenisms in terms of preserving the teachings of the past, because that's part of what, as I pointed out also, is that we don't have the capacity to evaluate our current position in relation to prior cultures and civilizations, or our position on the earth now, or our position in the universe. I'm not sure if this is exactly what you might be getting at. Is it about partly traditions and kind of like, is it in relation to or confronted by AI as we are?
It could, but also I was referring to a way of thinking that is not, and a way of reasoning that is not necessarily linear and logical and based on historical knowledge. So if AI apparently, at least according to the latest research, can reason and can orchestrate existing know-how and knowledge, and also reason about new solutions in a way that is linear in a sense and defined by logic and connections among topics. So it's still not doable at the moment, at least by AI, to create things that are completely crazy, or to create crazy art, or to connect the dots in novel ways that are not linear, not obvious, let's say. And so what AI could probably do is a very good librarian, or a very good job in orchestrating and retrieving ancient knowledge and traditions and known stuff, and potentially reasoning about the potential solutions that are not analogical, that are analogies to other things that have been solved in the past. So I was wondering if Gurdjieff stuff could potentially instead create a new school of thinking, that by pulling way of thinking from music, from philosophy, from theosophy, from other ways of thinking, other hats, could create a resilient defense for humans in the age of AI. And so potentially could become a Gurdjieffian school of thinking, whatever, even in a place like this.
Yeah.
Instead of just hoping that rules and politicians will prohibit AI to take jobs.
So just because we're already over our 5 minutes, I think I'll defer maybe for now. I think this is a really interesting question. I think the only thing I might say, just is to kind of put this back up, and because I already referred to this, but whatever approach we might come up with and bringing some of the things together that you're suggesting, I think that the model for education needs to shift. And so what that's going to entail is not just AI works on one level. I mean, I don't have a deep understanding of it right now at present, especially because it's been changing so much. But Gurdjieff's understanding of knowledge and history is always predicated first and foremost on being. And so if one has being, then it's a different conversation altogether. And the balance of the centers. So it seems to me that there's on one level, AI is functioning on maybe what more reflective of one-centered formatory apparatus. It may be also more complex than that, and it's going to get more complex. But for us to survive, I think it's going to mean that we have to give a focus to more of this balanced education and this development of reason, which I don't think that AI can attain in the same way. Here again, with these points I made earlier about genuine learned beings. So maybe, we should stop so we can get on to the next panel, but maybe there'll be more time or time in between sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.